The Corpus Hermeticum is the name for 17 tracts, or small writings, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, who is the same famous figure credited with the writing of the Emerald Tablet, and thought at one point by some Christian fathers and Renaissance scholars to have predated Moses. Hermes Trismegistus comes to us as a Greco-Egyptian fusion of the Greek gods Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, and becomes a title used by inspired Egyptian priests in mid to late antiquity. In these texts, we find rich teachings of ethics, metaphysics, theology, cosmology, and much more. Of the tracts of the corpus, written in Greek, the Latin text named the Asclepius stands apart, but is usually included in a study of proper Hermetica, a term which applies to all writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. The modern English edition of the corpus currently favored by scholars is the Copenhaver translation. Interesting additions also came from Walter Scott and G.R.S. Mead, whose commentaries are well worth studying. In part, we have Michael Psellos to thank for preserving some of the Hermetic manuscripts. Psellos was a Byzantine Greek monk and writer in the 11th century who fueled Platonic studies in Byzantium. Around the 15th century AD, the corpus came into Italy, where Cosimo Medici employed Marsilio Ficino, then in his late 20s, to translate the majority of the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin. Famously, Ficino is said to have set down his translation of Plato's complete works in order to translate the Hermetica, but this has become an exaggerated story because Ficino and Medici's handling of their incomplete translation of the corpus actually doesn't indicate too much enthusiasm. The Latin version of the corpus appears by 1471, but was not printed in Greek until the 16th century. And we should not fail to mention the Italian poet Lazzarelli, who translated the remaining tracts of the corpus, which were published in 1507. Now, tracing the Hermetica from the time they were circulating in 3rd century Greco-Roman Egypt until they circulated in the Renaissance has been like trying to stitch back history with an invisible thread. In recent years, however, we have learned that the star-worshipping Sabians of Haran, a city in Upper Mesopotamia, engaged with Hermes in their writings as a patron god of astrology. It isn't out of the question that the Sabians and certain Arabic philosophers had custody of certain Hermetica during the centuries where the texts seemed to disappear. The Emerald Tablet itself is an Arabian text, often lauded as being at the foundation of alchemy. It was composed at the start of the 9th century AD. As one legend goes, the text was the apparent discovery of Apollonius of Tyana, who found Hermes' genuine Emerald Tablet in a secret tunnel, the translation of which is thought to have been disseminated by Arabian Ismailis who identified Hermes with their prophet Idris. Kevin von Bladel reports on the Arabic Hermes in his book by the same name, and suggests who might have held on to the Hermetica before it was transmitted into Byzantium and later the esoteric and alchemical circles in the Renaissance. It is unfortunate that some researchers have run away with the idea that the Emerald Tablet lies at the foundation of the Hermetic tradition, and that some suggest it is much older than we have any reason to believe. Its role in this respect is exaggerated, and it by no means overshadows the more useful material found in the Corpus Hermeticum. In fact, there are many versions of the Emerald Tablet translation, all of which are thought to have been compromised at least to some degree. But it is in the Emerald Tablet, which also contains cosmological implications, where we find the famous saying, "That which is above is like unto that which is below, and what is below is like unto that which is above, to make the miracle of the one thing." A saying which has many earlier counterparts in the Corpus Hermeticum. Now, the dating of the corpus manuscripts have been the subject of heated disagreement over the centuries. Many assumptions of certain early Christians and Renaissance writers were corrected, and its various translators' opinions adjusted by emerging studies, leading to many centuries of refinement in the Hermetic situation. For now, the texts of the corpus are known to have been composed no later than the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. This varies upon who you ask, of course. For instance, the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie suggested that the text titled the Korrekasmu dated back to the 6th century BC. No one really believes that anymore, but considering the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty was ruling Egypt around 305 BC, we could see how native Egyptian texts would have been summarized, modernized, or translated for a Greek audience. We find an example of this with the high priest Manetho, the Egyptian, when he writes on Egyptian history to a Greek pharaoh in the 3rd century BC. One major point of debate in this study has been whether or not the religious texts attributed to Trismegistus are testaments of the long sought-after ancient Egyptian religion, the religion of that same heritage alluded to, defamed, or otherwise exaggerated by the Greeks, Arabs, and others. After all, the Hermetica was written in Egypt in the Greek language, with the added flourish of the philosophical qualities the Greek language offered. In recent decades, it is also wondered whether or not the prejudice against the hunters of ancient Egypt's religion may have also played a factor in bringing the dates of the text forward. In some cases, it might not have sat well with the early Christians to have heretical writings from Egyptian priests contradicting, or on the other hand, reflecting the same sentiments of the New Testament writings. But Hermetica were by no means denounced by every Christian who engaged with them. In fact, the first person known to have called themselves a Hermeticist was Lodovico Lazzarelli, the Italian poet and philosopher in the early Renaissance, who was also a Christian. Indeed, many earlier Christian philosophers accepted Hermes as a legitimate teacher and tried to put Hermes and Thoth in their places chronologically, not always succeeding, some perceiving that Hermes was a teacher of great wisdom after the biblical flood. And we can see that from the Edfu inscriptions in Egypt, Thoth was at one stage thought to have gifted Egypt their great sciences immediately following a cataclysmic flood. But by the 2nd century in Greco-Roman Egypt, the name Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes Thrice-Greatest, was used to denote not Thoth or Hermes separately, but a combination of both gods. However, Trismegistus is much more of a man, priest, or prophet than a proper god. Such insights have come after a great deal of work over the centuries, but it still hardly covers the whole story. The so-called Book of Thoth, in recent publication from papyri called The Conversations in the House of Life, shows us that Egyptians were already writing dialogues between a master and disciple prior to the Corpus Hermeticum. The master in these Egyptian texts is equated to the god Thoth on account that priests would have naturally written sacred texts under the inspiration of this deity, and so would have attributed the god with the authorship of the text as well. This instrument of a pseudonym would also serve to let a reader focus on the contents of the text itself, and not necessarily on who wrote it. The Conversations in the House of Life is written on numerous papyri in the Demotic script. The Demotic script becoming widely used in the 8th century BC in Egypt, but with Thoth being worshipped from the most ancient age, it shouldn't be controversial to see how a longer tradition of Hermetic writings or Thoth cult writings could have existed in Egypt prior to the Ptolemaic period. The idea of earlier Hermetic writings isn't something new in any case, there's just new evidence to support it. The philosopher Iamblichus, writing around 300 AD, told us that Hermes has put everything together in his 20,000 books as Seleucus listed them, or 36,555 as Manetho tells it. Now for Manetho, an Egyptian priest in the 3rd century BC, to refer back to a long lineage of Hermetic texts is suggestive of an earlier starting date to the Hermetic writings. But known Hermetica number only to a couple dozen titles, especially when we include the excerpts from Stobaeus, whereas Manetho and others would make it seem like there were many more books in circulation. And so the plot thickens, because by Manetho's time, Hermes was already amalgamated into Thoth. So isn't it reasonable to propose the Hermetic priesthood could have just been an extension of the earlier Thoth cults? Now, when you read the Christian church father Clement of Alexandria's account of a ceremonial procession of a Hermetic priesthood in the 2nd century AD, each Hermetic priest in the procession carries a different textbook authored by Hermes Trismegistus, each textbook pertaining to specific sciences like astronomy, music, or mathematics. indicating a Hermetic priesthood in this late era of Egyptian civilization when many of the world's religious ideas had trickled through Alexandria. If only we had more literary and physical evidence of this Hermetic religion, we might be able to put some of these mysteries to rest. But especially in the case of Hermetic literature, we shouldn't count absence of evidence as evidence of absence. What the evidence does support is the likelihood of the Hermetic texts of the corpus originating in the 2nd century in Alexandria. But we can't know necessarily if these were copied from older documents, even though they definitely contain examples of themes and teachings found in older Egyptian papyri. It has also been shown that the Hermetic philosophy mirrors some Platonic, Gnostic, and esoteric Jewish ideas, and yet at the same time we know that ancient Egypt, far earlier than either of the Greek or Hebrew schools, had a definite influence on these other traditions. So once again, it's impossible to erase the Egyptian influence on the Hermetic corpus. Even so, from Manetho to Cicero, writers speak of multiple different Hermeses existing in both extremes of the timeline, Thoth being the first and the Greek son of Zeus and Maia in the middle, and the late Trismegistus as the last. So yes, as we have shown in previous videos, the god is still a shifty traveler, wearing many cloaks and everywhere unable to be grasped. Of the manuscripts in the Corpus Hermeticum, modern scholars have sought to divide them into technical and philosophical writings, but there's no evidence that original Hermeticists used such categories, and in fact no ancient philosopher employed the same categories of modern scholarship on their own writings, so they can in that sense become a hindrance in the effort to interpret these writings as they might have been perceived in the ancient world. Surprise, surprise. Now, it is clear that not every text in the corpus is written by the same author, considering there are contradictions and variations of diction in the texts, even though they are written under the assumed persona of Trismegistus. To this interesting point, the Neoplatonist Iamblichus gives us some insight, writing from the perspective of someone privy to the esoteric Egyptian teachings. Iamblichus says, Hermes, the god who presides over language, was formerly very properly considered as common among priests, and the power who presides over the true science concerning the gods is one and the same in the whole of things. Hence our ancestors dedicated the inventions of their wisdom to this deity, inscribing all their own writings with the name of Hermes. Thus Iamblichus simultaneously attributes thousands of books to Hermes, but indicates that Egyptian priests also tagged Hermes as the author of their own writings. So we're dealing with a situation where a priesthood appears to be identifying a quality of writing or a state of being in which they produce such writings with the influence of their god, almost as if there's no difference between them and the god in these inspired moments. This should tell us something about the gods themselves and how modern casual definitions of them are misconstrued, but we will have to reserve that idea for later. Now, in the Hermetic corpus, there are a few different accounts of cosmology, or the origins of the world and the universe, beyond the account in the text called Poemandres, or the Pymander. And while there is so much more room for contextualization and disclaiming, let's transition into the texts themselves. In a discourse of Hermes to his pupil Tat, in the text titled The Mixing Bowl or the Monad, we find Hermes explaining, quote, Since the craftsman made the whole cosmos by reasoned speech, not by hand, you should conceive of him as present, as always existing, as having made all things, as the one and only, and as having crafted by his own will the things that are. But you will see in the Poemandres a distinction between the craftsman and the God, Father, Mind, or Nous, which exists above or before it. And in the third manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, titled A Sacred Discourse of Hermes, we read, In the deep there was boundless darkness and water and fine intelligent spirit, all existing by divine power in chaos. Then a holy light was sent forth, and elements solidified out of liquid essence, and all the gods divided the parts of germinal nature. While all was unlimited and unformed, light elements were set apart to the heights, and the heavy were grounded in the moist sand, the whole of them delimited by fire and raised aloft, to be carried by spirit. The heavens appeared in 7 circles, the gods became visible in the shapes of the stars and all their constellations, and the arrangement of this lighter substance corresponded to the gods contained in it. The periphery rotated in the air, carried in a circular course by divine spirit. Through his own power, each god sent forth what was assigned to him, and the beasts came to be, 4-footed, crawling, water-dwelling, winged, and every germinating seed in grass and every flowering plant, within them they had the seed of rebirth. The gods sowed the generations of humans to know the works of God, to be a working witness to nature, to increase the number of mankind, to master all things under heaven, to discern the things that are good, to increase by increasing, and multiply by multiplying. And through the wonder-working course of the cycling gods, they created every soul incarnate to contemplate heaven, the course of the heavenly gods, the works of God and the working of nature, to examine things that are good, to know divine power. There you have a kind of Hermetic Genesis, which may remind us of the Hebrew Genesis and Plato's Timaeus, even though every effort to show that the Trismegistus authors borrowed from these accounts has proved to be sketchy. Now let us turn to what may be the most important Hermetic text of all, the Poemandres or Pymander, which presents to us the visionary experience of Hermes Trismegistus and his dialogue with Poemandres, who is also called the Nous, the mind, divine mind, or the universal mind. And where I don't use the translation itself to present the text, I will summarize as needed. Once when thought came to me of the things that are, and my thinking soared high, and my bodily senses were restrained, like someone heavy with sleep from too much eating or toil of body, an enormous being completely unbounded in size seemed to appear to me and call my name and say to me, "What do you want to hear and see? What do you want to learn and know from your understanding?" "Who are you?" I asked. "I am Poemandres," he said, "mind of sovereignty. I know what you want, and I am with you everywhere." I said I wish to learn the things that are, to understand their nature, and to know God. "How much I want to hear," I said. Then he said to me, "Keep in mind all that you wish to learn, and I will teach you." Saying this, he changed his appearance, and in an instant everything was immediately opened. And in the endless vision all became clear and joyful light, and Hermes loved it. After some time, however, darkness rose separate from the light, and descended in a fearful gloom, coiling like a snake. And the darkness changed to an agitated watery form, smoking as if from fire. And from it a great roar echoed with unspeakable volume. The voice wailed as if born from fire itself. And yet from the light a holy word mounted the watery nature, and the fire leapt up to the heights from the water. And fire pierced the air, and the elements were suspended above the conjoined earth and water, due to the spiritual word that set them in motion. Poemandres said to me, "Have you understood what this vision means?" "I shall come to know," I said. "I am the light you see, mind, your God," he said, "who existed before the watery nature that appeared out of the darkness. The light-giving word who comes from mind is the Son of God." And Hermes tells Poemandres, his mind and God to go on, and the God tells him, "This is what you must know. That in you which sees and hears is the word of the Lord, but your mind is God the Father. They are not divided from one another, for their union is life." "Thank you," I said. And Poemandres says, "Understand the light, then, and recognize it." And therefore the great being stared into Hermes' face so long he trembled at the sight of him. And Poemandres raises his head, and Hermes then sees in his mind the light of powers beyond expression or number, a cosmos without a limit or boundary. And Hermes writes, "In the vision I had because of the discourse of Poemandres, these were my thoughts. Since I was terrified out of my wits, he spoke to me again. In your mind you have seen the archetypal form, the pre-principle that exists before a beginning and without end." And Hermes asks whence the elements of nature had arisen. And Poemandres tells him, "They have arisen from the God who is life and light, who took in the word and imitated a beautiful cosmos. By speaking, the God brought forth a second mind, a craftsman, who, as God of fire and spirit, crafted the 7 governors. They encompass the sensible world in circles, and their government is called fate." And Poemandres says that the word of God leapt from the heavy elements and set straight to the craftwork of nature. The weighty matter without mind was left behind. The craftsman mind, together with the word, encompassing the circles and whirling them about with a rush, turned his craftworks about, letting them turn from an endless beginning to a limitless end, for it starts where it stops. And the circles do as they are willed by mind to do, and bring forth living things without reason from matter, and beings who no longer kept the word with them. And the air and water brought forth creatures suitable to their elements. The inseparable earth and water bore up whatever mind wished, the creatures in the earth that crawl and the animals. Mind, the father of all, who is life and light, gave birth to a man like himself, whom he loved as his own child. The man was most fair, he had the Father's image, and God, who was really in love with his own form, bestowed on him all his craftworks. And after the man had observed what the craftsman had created with the Father's help, he also wished to make some of the craftwork, and the Father agreed to this. And the man entered the craftsman's sphere, where he was to hold authority. And the 7 governors, equated with the sun and moon and 5 planets, loved the man and gave to him a share of their unique power. And the man learned by sharing in their wisdom, and he sought to breach through the circumference of the circles to observe the rule of the one who held power over fire. Man, having authority over the unreasoning animals and all the cosmos, broke through the vault and witnessed the majesty of the cosmic framework, putting on display for all lower nature an example of the beauty of God. And nature smiled with love at the man who took the form of a god. For in the water she saw the shape of the man's fairest form, and upon the earth its shadow. When the man saw in the water the form like himself as it was in nature, he loved it and wished to inhabit it. Wish and action came in the same moment, and he inhabited the unreasoning form. Nature took hold of her beloved, hugged him all about and embraced him, for they were lovers. Because of this, unlike any other living thing on earth, mankind is twofold, in the body mortal, but immortal in the essential man. And Poemandres explains that even though man is immortal, he is subjected now to fate, and is a slave within it. Love and sleep have become his masters, even though he comes from one who is sleepless. But with the union of nature and man, nature gave birth to 7 men at once, who were rooted in the qualities of the 7 governors. And after this, O Poemandres, now I have come into a great longing, and I yearn to hear, so do not digress. And Poemandres said, Be silent, I have not yet unfolded to you the first discourse. As you see, I am silent, said I. And thus earth, water, fire, and spirit brought forth bodies of man and light and life, became their soul and mind, and a great cycle in the cosmos began. When the cycle was completed, all beings, who were thus far androgynous, became either male or female. And God at once spoke a holy speech, Increase in increasing, and multiply in multitude, all you creatures and craftworks. And let him who is mindful recognize that he is immortal, that desire is the cause of death, and let him recognize all that exists. And from that speech the creatures and mankind began to make intercourse, but those who saw their own nature in the love attained the good, while those who loved the body and gave themselves over to desire plummeted to the darkness, because desire is the very cause of death. And Hermes inquires about how those who lack knowledge could be deprived of immortality, and Poemandres tells him, You behave like a person who has not given thought to what he has heard. Did I not tell you to think? And so the dialogue proceeds, and Hermes questions Poemandres yet again, asking how he shall advance in life, and asks whether or not all people have mind. Poemandres says, Hold your tongue, fellow, enough talk, and then explains that those who are good and pure are quickly aided by him and recognize the truth, and give praise and thanks as they should, and they loathe the senses knowing their truth. And Poemandres acts as a gatekeeper to ward off evils from afflicting them. But to the thoughtless and greedy, the wicked and evil people, Poemandres remains distant. Whereas the avenging demon arms such wicked persons to continue to do their ills, so that in the end their punishment and their need to right their wrongs will only increase. Such a person does not cease longing after insatiable appetites, struggling in the darkness without satisfaction. This tortures him and makes the fire grow upon him all the more. Then Hermes acknowledges the wisdom Poemandres has taught him, and he learns the way up to heaven and how it happens. And Poemandres tells him how, at every one of the 7 spheres, he will be stripped of impulses and traits, respective only of that material world the soul will be leaving upon death. And teaching Hermes this, Poemandres then asks him, having learned all this, should you not become a guide to the worthy, so that through you the human race might be saved by God? And Poemandres then vanishes back into the powers, and sends Hermes forth. And Hermes takes his newfound wisdom and seeks to instruct mankind, to make them reverent so that they see the same truth as he does. He calls out to those who have surrendered to sleep like a drunken sickness. He tells them to sober up and stop living in the ignorance of God, and he tells them to leave behind corruption and take a share of immortality. And there are those who, in seeing the truth of his words, casted themselves at his feet and thanked God, but others withdrew in mockery and dismissal, not knowing and not caring about any truth that could divert them from the path of darkness they walk. But for the ones who were to be initiated into the vision of Hermes, these were instructed to spread the message further, and they gave their thanks before turning in for bed. And then Hermes headed off for his resting place, cherishing the vision of Poemandres, knowing that he was now filled with all he wished, and the sleep of his body transformed into awareness. The closing of my eyes became true vision, my silence became pregnant with good, and the birthing of the world became a progeny of goods. And with all his might Hermes gave praise to God in 9 lines of prayer, afterward saying, "You whom we address in silence, the unspeakable, the unsayable, accept these pure speech offerings from my heart and let it reach up to you." And so Hermes promises that with his gift he will work to enlighten his brothers and sisters under God, and will advance to light and life as he was made to do. What we have just heard is a synopsis of mostly the cosmological aspect of one of many great discourses in the Hermetic literature, beginning with a mystical vision of Hermes, when his thoughts and his energies are keyed into the divine mind, and this Poemandres comes to him and shows him a mighty experience that ends up being the visual expression of the Hermetic cosmology, which Poemandres proceeds to explain. We have in this teaching the same 7 powers or 7 governors that we have seen in previous cosmologies, such as the Babylonian and Gnostic and Zoroastrian. We have the elements and their position in the creative act defined, and just as we saw in Genesis and the Egyptian accounts, the Holy Word, the Son of God, the first speech of the One, is the light that moves over or mounts the waters and sets into action the movement of creation, and the birth of the divine spirit that would eventually inhabit the realms of matter in a quest to return to the light, and craft, in nature, all the beautiful things that mimic the great craftsman mind of God. Much like the Egyptian Ptah, who molds clay into the shape of man, and Ra, who speaks the world into being. Also, this mounting of the water and the resulting organization of the elements reminds us of the Emerald Tablet when it reads, "If cast to earth, it will separate earth from fire, the subtle from the gross. With great capacity it ascends from earth to heaven." Once the spirit of the first man, without gender, rises to know the beauty of his Creator and mimic that Creator's work, his reflection shines on the lower waters, and the wish to inhabit the earth is in him. From this the bodies of mankind are brought forth with the power of the 7 governors, and the genders are formed, giving rise to those who would plunge further into the darkness with the desires of flesh and material, and those who would rise to the light by obeying God's command to multiply and pay due reverence to the Holy Word and the gods that are one with it. Poemandres makes clear that those who do wicked deeds and take too great a share in the darkness will fall prey to the vengeful demon. Such darkness will not be allowed to return to the light without correction. But Hermes sees the problem, knowing that so many are in the dark and ignorant, and Poemandres offers him the chance to spread the light which Hermes proceeds to do, showing us a Hermetic meaning of enlightenment, not to hold on to it all for oneself, but to aid in the work of God by spreading it out to those who would take their share of immortality, but not to do so with any greed or wicked intent. As we read in the third manuscript of the corpus, quote, "And through the wonder-working course of the cycling gods, they created every soul incarnate to contemplate heaven, the course of the heavenly gods, the works of God, and the working of nature, to examine things that are good, to know divine power." Revealed in the Hermetic corpus are the mysteries of cosmology, similarly expressed by various religious texts, and we see how the Poemandres text bears similarity to the Apocryphon of John and other stories, how they each begin with a mystical vision and proceed through dialogue, and how there is a reflection on the water of the spirit of man, which prompts the creation of man and woman on the material plane. As well, we have the word or speech playing its major role in creation, much as speech and breath are also fundamental in the Hebrew Genesis. In the Poemandres, it is specified that this word, who comes from mind, is the Son of God. If we were to define the Hermetic one God, as known by Hermes in this text, the Hermetic God is the Father of the universe, whose will perfects itself by means of its own powers, whose will is made known to those who give thanks and are good, who is the energy and cause of all the things that are, who contains all of nature as an image of itself, but is never confined to any form produced by nature. The Hermetic God transcends all efforts to be defined or captured, and is far better than all the praise it could ever receive. It has no beginning, and shall never end. There is plenty more to draw out from the Poemandres, and the corpus altogether, especially the mystical aspect of this text, which I believe does not get enough attention. In that regard, I'm saying we're likely looking at an out-of-body or astral experience being described in the Poemandres, which contains thematic parallels to current out-of-body or near-death experiences. As a closing remark on the Corpus Hermeticum, I've always believed them to be the most neglected religious texts in the Western world. Not only do they contain moral precepts and practical, usable instructions, but their explanations of the metaphysical qualities of nature are among the most profound and succinctly stated material I've ever come across in religious texts. And the parallels that can be drawn with Hermetica and other texts around its time is an area that deserves much more attention. Now, I've made this graph to present the Hermetic cosmological distribution, which is available for download to all patrons, along with the ascent of the soul through the 7 spheres graph, where at each sphere the soul discards one or another now useless aspect of the mortal life. What the cosmological graph shows is the top-down sequential steps of the Hermetic creation in the Poemandres, with the twofold nature of man below, who is forever touching both darkness and the light and life of God. In the future, we will continue studying the Corpus Hermeticum and its rich history. If you would like to support this effort and all the work I do on this channel, please consider supporting the Patreon, linked below in the description. Thank you for liking and subscribing, and until next time, be like Hermes and advance to life.